Hi, good morning. I'm here with Professor Mike McCarthy and Jeanne McCarten. And could you tell us about your presentation yesterday, which focused on spoken grammar and also the teaching implications of that?
Well, let's start with the spoken grammar itself first. For many years, grammar reference books and grammar teaching were understandably dominated by writing. We didn't have tape recorders, we didn't have the ability to record ordinary everyday conversation. Now we have smartphones, we have small tape recorders. We can record conversations very easily, and then with the help of computer software, we can analyze millions of words of conversation to see how grammar operates in that very special environment of face-to-face interaction. And when we do that, we find it's quite different from grammar in writing. We may find the same structures as we find in writing, but very often they have quite different functions in conversation. We also find in conversation items which are much more frequent than they are in writing, and vice versa. Things that are common in writing, but we hardly ever use them in speaking. When we look at a large corpus of conversation, some core key features emerge, maybe 3 or 4 key principles. And the first is that the grammar is co-created, it's co-constructed. The theme of this conference has been creativity, and really nothing is more creative than conversation. It's not predictable, it doesn't have a script, and it is created jointly by the participants in the conversation. Not just the topics, but the actual syntactic structures, so we can add subordinate clauses onto another person's main clause, for example. You can say to me, this building is 500 years old, and another person I can answer, which is amazing. And together we've created a sentence. So that makes it quite different from writing. But we also find that another feature of conversation is that it takes the grammar, the basic grammar, for example, the tenses, the present tense, the past tense, and the aspects, simple, continuous verbs, and uses them for strategic purposes. So I might, if I was one of your students, come to you and say, I want to ask you a question. Perfectly grammatically correct, but perhaps not as friendly, not as polite, not as likely to get your cooperation as if I say, I was wanting to ask you a question, or I wanted to ask you a question. By shifting from the present tense to the past, I've created a different relationship with you, one of respect, of politeness, of friendliness, depending on the context. And it's this kind of thing that shows us that grammar is not only a set of rules, most importantly, it's a set of choices. And it's in conversation that we see these choices really manifested. I don't know if that helps to answer your first question.
Yes, it does. In your talk, you also touched upon the issue of fluency and how all of this research, its findings, is ultimately enlightening us about how to develop fluency. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes. Well, I think, you see, in the past, fluency has been considered from the point of view of the single speaker. So we give people tests, oral examinations, and we ask them to speak for 1 minute on a topic, or 2 minutes on a topic, or speak to the examiner, etc. And the problem there is that this does not represent how it is that natural conversation flows. The word fluency comes from the Latin verb fluere, meaning to flow like a river, so water flows. And it is fundamentally important to understand that for the ordinary public, the man and woman in the street, they use the word fluent. They use the concept of fluency. It is one of those rare examples of a concept that we, the academics, we, the professional language educators, actually share with the ordinary people. So it behoves us, it's absolutely essential that we should get it right. And what we find when we look at a spoken corpus is that fluency, this sense of flow, is jointly created. It's created by my ability to bridge what I am saying with what you have just said, and then when it's your turn to speak, how do you hook on what you are going to say to what I've just said? And those examples that I mentioned earlier about putting a subordinate clause onto the main clause which another speaker has said is a very good example of that. The main clause acts as a kind of statement of the topic, and then if I add a subordinate clause, it's like it's hooked onto it. It joins it. They're connected, they're linked, and they contribute to that sense of flow and fluency. And it's very interesting that going outside of linguistics and applied linguistics, if we look at sociolinguistic research, we find that, for example, immigrant communities, incoming populations, are often judged on their fluency, and it is an ordinary lay perception, and if you are perceived as fluent, you actually have greater social capital, you succeed more in the world of work, in the world of professional and vocational life. And so it is a fundamentally important thing that we need to investigate. And we've tried to investigate it from the point of view of spoken grammar. But you could also do the same for vocabulary, for phonology, or any aspect of it. How do I create flow, what I call confluence in the conversation?
This research is fascinating, but from my perspective as a teacher, what I particularly enjoyed about your talk yesterday were the teaching implications of all this. I don't know whether you'd like to elaborate on that, Jeanne.
Just to pick up on what Mike was saying about fluency having social capital, it's an important part of learning a language, and I think we want our students to be fluent, we want them to be able to engage in conversations, but so often we present them with a set of written texts. So I think the first teaching implication of conversational language is that we should illustrate or show features of spoken language within conversations. We should bring the conversation back to materials, back to the page. I think they fell out of favour a little while ago because maybe because they weren't particularly natural, or because we didn't have the corpus to show us what real conversation looked like many years ago. And I think it's good if we can bring them back to the classroom so we can illustrate, to use Carter and McCarthy's term, what spoken language looks like. For example, the which clause that Mike just referred to, you can show them one example in a conversation and have them find others and discuss with the students the features of the conversation, have them interact with it in a different way. This is, of course, once they've worked with it as a piece of communication and understood it. And so
You've been a classroom teacher for many, many years. You have plenty of experience of teaching language. How easy is it for the ordinary teacher to actually apply the insights developed in this research to English language teaching?
I think that's a really good question, and I think it's easy to do if you have the right material to do it with. And if you look at some of the materials that employ this kind of methodology, I know the authors have worked very hard to make it pick up and go. You don't need to be an expert in applied linguistics or corpus linguistics. You can just take the activities that are on the page into the class and they'll work for you. Because one of the principles that we've always stuck to is that when we're doing this kind of work, which is perhaps a little bit different from what teachers are used to, it's important to keep something familiar. So we use familiar activity types so that no one has to worry about having to spend hours and hours preparing for something different. It's accessible, it's easy to teach. And for students, we've tried very hard to, and it's important to do this, is to use topics that they're familiar with. We're not asking them to do sort of cognitively difficult task. We want them to have the space and the time to practice and to become more fluent.
So we've explored the teaching implications, but how about teacher education and development? How can this research feed into the development of teachers?
Well, I think we're very privileged these days because we have some wonderful reference grammars, for example, that we can go to. Grammars like the Cambridge Grammar of English and the Longman Grammar of Spoken and Written English by Douglas Biber and his team. And as I said, the Cambridge Grammar of English written by Carter and Carthy. So we have there a reference backstop, if you like, where we can go to get this kind of information. And I think teacher development courses can incorporate this because they have the literature now, both in the reference grammars and in numerous articles on the subject. So I think it's very important for teacher development programs to include this kind of research, because teachers need to know what real conversation is like. We don't want teachers to think that students are making mistakes when they use spoken grammar, for example, because this is how conversation is. So I think it's very vitally important to have this in teacher development programs.
Yes, I mean, I might mention, for example, that in connection with resources, Jeanne has mentioned the latest reference grammars. The English Profile Project, which is a massive online resource for teachers, is free, and it now has a grammar section called the English Grammar Profile, which teachers can access free of charge. And there they will find all the structures of the common grammar which they have been teaching for years, with examples based on learner corpus evidence and other corpus evidence, showing you how these items are really used and how the learners use them, typically at what level and so on. So the information from corpus research is feeding both into materials, which we've already mentioned, reference books and online resources. And I think there will be more and more of this available to teachers. And of course there are a number of corpora available online which have relatively easy search engines attached to them. But I would add to that that teacher education courses need to help teachers to get the best out of those online resources, because not everybody can really use to the full the power of a corpus. I mean, I've been working with corpora for since 1980. Jeanne has been also working since the mid-1980s. So, and we're still learning. You know, we're still learning how to take the maximum out of this treasure trove of the natural, real data that we have available. So I think teacher education courses will develop more into an awareness of corpus, at least I hope they will, and it will be considerably assisted by online resources, which will become more and more available.
Mike and Jeanne, thanks so much. I hope you enjoyed the rest of your stay in Malta. Thank you. Thanks so much.
So far, so I hope we'll enjoy the rest of it. Thank you for inviting us and making it possible.
Thank you.